Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Temple University, Japan, and the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies, ICAS, I am delighted to welcome and extend our heartfelt thanks to you, Kathy Matsui, for joining us and sharing your insights and time today. I'm David Satterwhite, adjunct faculty, and have been associated with Temple University, TUJ, for the past 20 years. I'm co-hosting today with TUJ faculty colleagues Abega Wadwell and Sarah Jean Rosito, who will also be jumping into the conversation and not only asking their own questions and sharing their insights, but channeling their students' questions to Kathy as well. Kathy, today's an informal fireside chat. We understand you. We do not have slides, a formal presentation. And to get things going, let me say that we are honored with the opportunity to commemorate the 25th anniversary of your 1999 initial Womenomics report. I want to start us off today, Kathy, with an opportunity for you to reflect on the ongoing efforts and the legacy of Womenomics over the last quarter century. And that sounds like a very long time. At some point during our conversation today, we're also quite eager to learn more about your efforts after you've left Goldman Sachs and have set up MPower's partners. So with that, Kathy, I'll stop talking and encourage you to share with us your reflections as we mark the 25th anniversary of Womenomics. Please.
Thanks, David, and thanks to Temple University and everybody who's taken the time out of their busy Tuesday to join us. So as David kindly introduced, I initially broached the topic of Womenomics back in 1999 when I was still at Goldman Sachs. And maybe it might help to give you a little bit of context as to what even triggered this topic of research. I was a Japanese strategist in my former life at Goldman. And I began my career as a Japanese equity strategist in January of 1990, when frankly, the Japanese stock market, the economy, everything was doing really, really well. It was actually at the tail end of the so-called asset bubble period. I didn't know it was a tail end. I thought it was still, ongoing. But needless to say, that was the beginning of the end, so to speak, for the bubble period. And once I started my career, as a Japanese equity strategist, my job was to provide analysis and advice to institutional investors, people managing pension money, mutual fund capital, both inside Japan and outside Japan, about what the future might hold for the Japanese equity market, for the economy, etc. And given that was the end of the party, there was not a lot of positive things to come up with, right? The economy was falling into recession. Asset prices were collapsing, both property and stocks, which meant that the collateral underlying a lot of the loans and the debts in the banking system was shrinking in value, which meant that banks who previously thought that they were holding a healthy portfolio, it turned out to be quite unhealthy in the end. So a lot of bad debts crippling, frankly, the banking system. And of course, we also saw the beginnings of deflation, prices falling, which is very unusual for really any economy, but wages and prices falling, that was the beginning as well. So in this context, I was always asked the question, particularly by my foreign investor clients, Kathy, why on earth should we even look at Japan? What is the rationale? And at that point, also in 1999, I had given birth to our first child in 1996, and noticed that after returning to work, at that time it was Goldman's global maternity leave policy to take 4 months off for leave, which I did, and came back full time right after that. But noticed that, looking around me, many of my Japanese mamatomo or other mommy friends, of course, some of them opted to stay at home and become stay-at-home moms, which I completely and utterly respect. But there are also quite a number of my friends who wanted to return to their careers full time, like I had, but for a whole list of reasons found it very, very difficult to do so. So you see, I had this professional context where people were asking me, why on earth should they invest in Japan? And in my personal context, I was looking at a very large pool of talent right in front of me that were not working. And as many of you know, for any economy, the drivers of growth for an advanced economy, for a developing economy, there's only 3 drivers, and that is that country's labor, that country's capital or money, and that country's productivity. And given the already pretty bleak projections about the first driver, which is demographics for the country, unless there was, or there could be, a revolution, so to speak, in productivity, and or abundant and infinite capital available, which is not the case. Look at the fiscal position of the nation. That without changing those levers dramatically, that lever of labor shrinking over time would mean that the nation's, Japan's potential growth rate would not grow, but frankly fall. And that was a very dire, prospect. So I latched onto this labor piece, and again, looking at, around me, surrounded by very talented women, and thought to myself, well, let's see, let's do a what if scenario, because I'm an analyst, so I can play with numbers, right? And at that point, I just did a very simple study with my colleagues, and we crafted the scenario whereby if at that point Japan's female labor participation rate was one of the lowest in the developed world, what if it rose to the level that we see with Japanese men, which is among some of the world's highest? But we just, again, play with numbers, what if? And that resulted in, at that time, about a 10% uplift to Japan's GDP, which of course is not a small number. It's a very large uplift, if that were true. And so that's the context. And you also have to appreciate that when I started my career back in 1990, I was the only female equity strategist. When I retired in 2020, I was still the only female strategist. And the name of the game in that area, or that I was competing in, was about how to get support from your clients. It's a very transparent world. People vote, your clients vote for you, or they don't vote for you, right? And that translates into commissions for your firm. So super competitive, and everybody else pretty much were Japanese men that I was competing against. And I thought, well, this might be a topic that my competitors would not write about. So just kind of decided to write about this. And frankly speaking, when I first came out with the report 25 years ago, I had 2 contrasting reactions. On the one hand, foreign investors, my foreign clients thought, oh, this is really interesting. They didn't really understand what was going on with, Japanese females in the workplace, etc. So yeah, the scenario I painted looked very intriguing. On the other hand, my Japanese domestic clients, they saw, well, that's interesting kind of speculation, but it will never come true. And so, where's the Nikkei gonna go next week was sort of the reaction at the time. So it was really only until 2013, 2014 when the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came to power for the second time, where frankly, completely out of the blue, in a speech, I think it was in the United States, he mentions that in order for his national growth strategy, what he called Abenomics at the time, to be effective, it needed to include Womenomics, or Womenomics was an imperative for growth. And, I think to your question, David, the probably biggest impact, if I could call it that this had, although it took a long time to come to fruition, was that this topic of gender diversity, which frankly, until that moment, was sort of, I would say, relegated, was considered by many people as a human rights and equality issue. In other words, if you cared about those issues, you cared about diversity. If you didn't care about those issues, you didn't really care about diversity. And so by positioning or moving the context of Womenomics into the realm of this is an imperative for growth, that's when people took a second look. That's what piqued the interest of people in the business world. That's what got CEOs, that's what got, policymakers to say, hey, we actually are running out of options in Japan to drive growth. And so maybe this is something we should take a closer look at. And so I think that repositioning the topic of gender diversity into this realm of growth as a economic and business imperative for growth was probably the biggest change that occurred.
David, you're on.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks very much for that background, Kathy, and I'm fascinated to hear that you were caught off guard by Prime Minister Abe's mention of Womenomics as one of the, I think, 3 pillars of his Abenomics in his talk to the U.S. rather than directly at consultation with you to begin with. But those were rough years and decades, the ending of the bubble, but then the period that you've described, and trying to interest your clients to invest in Japan. If we look back at that period, and as you just helped us review, what has worked and what hasn't? What are the tasks still ahead of us? And I know that there are going to be many, many questions from our students and Sarah Jane and Megha. But if we look at the study released at the 20th anniversary, while you were still with Goldman Sachs, there's a long list of recommendations for what corporations and the Japanese government should be doing. And so sort of asking you to recap as well, has the needle moved very much over the past 5 years in your sterling, compelling efforts to get the Japanese economy moving through the diversity, but also through the imperatives as you described, please.
So I think in terms of kind of cataloging or recording sort of what's improved and what hasn't. So what's improved is since really about 2013-14, and of course this is coincident with the economy starting to expand, starting to exit deflation, the job market becoming very, very tight, there was really no option but to leverage the existing talent pool, which of course a lot of women in the workplace that weren't working outside the home to work outside the home. So we went from, when I first started writing about this topic in 1999, Japan's average female labor participation rate, which is the way I defined it and the way most organizations define it, is women between the ages of 15 and 64, was around 56% or so in 1999. And with the factors I just described, post 2013, it shot up to over 71% versus the United States at that time. This is 2019, I guess, 2019-20, just before, or I guess 19, just before COVID. Japan's female labor participation rate, believe it or not, was higher than that of the United States, where I come from, 66%, and higher than the EU of like 63%. So the numbers, the quantity of women, Japanese women working outside the home, had reached an all-time record high. So that's really, pretty incredible. Number two, and this is something that I don't know how many years I struggled to lobby not just the government, but also the corporate sector in particular, was transparency around diversity within companies. Frankly, it was very difficult to even assess the degree to which leadership was diverse or employee workforces were diverse because there was simply no data. And in 2015, a law called the Female Employee Promotion Law was promulgated and went into force in 2016, which required organizations with 300 people or more to disclose their gender diversity conditions and ideally set targets. And with that, especially for large companies, with this sort of mandatory disclosure requirement, you at least start to figure out where the needle lie, or lay. If you don't know where the needle lies, then you can't really move that needle, right? Was my thought. So that was, I think, a big step forward. And the third thing that I think really changed for the better was parental leave policies. And for Japan, as many of you know, I think a lot of people maybe think Japan is way behind, but in fact, what happened in those ensuing years after 2013 was the government really beefed up parental leave benefits. So both the mother and the father, as you know, get 1 year each. Of course, most mothers take that leave or advantage of that leave, and most fathers don't take it at all or take only a small portion of that, but it is available. And if you work out the math in terms of various payments that go in the Social Security system and all this mechanics, you essentially can get up to 2/3 of your pre-leave pay during that duration, which is very, very generous. And so I think Japan's parental leave benefits are actually one of the top in the world, certainly better than what you can get in the United States, right? And so I think that's another big plus. Now, turning to what still hasn't happened and where we still need a lot of work, of course, is we have a lot of women now working outside the home, but we still have not enough women in leadership or decision-making positions, both in the private as well as the public sectors. And frankly, a lot of you in academia, maybe excluding Temple University, but if you look at most institutions, especially the big universities here, they're very, very low in terms of female representation. And so part of this, I think, has to do with the fact that while there are record numbers of women working outside the home now in Japan, more than half of those women are still working in a part-time capacity as opposed to full-time one, which obviously makes it more challenging to groom this talent to become leaders, managers, directors, whatever you want to call it. So it takes time. And maybe, hopefully down the road in years, and this of course doesn't happen overnight anywhere, but hopefully we're beginning to build a pipeline of female talent that will eventually, hold position of power in boardrooms, will hold positions of power in the Diet, local governments, etc. So that's sort of the what's improved and what still needs to be done. Of course, there's a lot of other things that need to be done, like the spousal tax deduction, the fact that women cannot keep their maiden names in their koseki. There's a lot of issues around that, but I'm just highlighting what I think are the biggest challenge.
Thank you again. I'm reflecting on your stunning TED Talk of 2011, in which you shared that the government of Norway in 2004, so that's 20 years ago, passed legislation requiring 40% of women on listed companies' boards. If we leapfrog from what you've just said and some of the positive changes that have taken place, both legally, the 2016 law, the disclosure law, and so on, would you say that the Japanese government could be doing more? And if so, what would be the next kind of legislative agenda to push Womenomics forward? And then after this question, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Jean and Mega and others. But yeah.
Well, like I just mentioned, there are still some arcane laws and rules in place that need to be, frankly, updated for the 21st century. And I wrote a lot about that in my last Womenomics 5.0 report, which you can all find online. To be honest, I think in terms of the private sector, should Japan adopt quotas like you see in many countries in Europe? That has obviously come up, has been discussed at length. And I think what the approach that is being pursued now, i.e., the stock exchange for prime listed companies, there is let's say, a heavy encouragement from the government to strive for 30%. They say yakuin, so, I guess that's strictly defined or translated as directors. And this is not board directors, this is yakuin, should be female. And there is strong encouragement also that at least one board director be female. And in fact, Goldman Sachs Asset Management or State Street or Norges or a lot of the Japanese trust banks, meaning asset managers here, as part of their so-called voting guidelines, also have the one female minimum. And if you don't have that one female minimum, that automatically means you vote no against the CEO when they're up for election or re-election in the shareholders meetings. So I think rather than a hard quota like 30-40%, Japan is what it typically does is going the soft route. Now, would it help? Of course it would help if there's a mandatory quota, but then what are you going to do? You're going to tell big companies in Japan that you're going to have to delist your company from the stock exchange if you don't have those numbers. That's very, very difficult, I think. So I think as practically speaking, they're trying to do what they can do, but it would simply take time, in my view. I think where the government could really do something significant and impactful in terms of intervention is in the public sphere. And I don't need to tell all of you who live in Japan, but the ratio of female representatives in the lower house of the Diet has been 10%, no more than 10% for 75 years. And that's unacceptable, in my view. Most countries have quotas for their parliaments or congresses, right? Not the United States, countries that need it have quotas. So that's where, and I've talked at length with various politicians about this, but, when you can't even allow women to keep their very names, it's kind of, maiden names is kind of difficult to push on this one, but, unless you get the decision makers in a more gender balanced structure, at the national level, it's very hard, I think, to expect that they're going to be very balanced in their views on so many things, right? And I mentioned this because if we think about and consider the fact of how Japan is geopolitically situated today, I don't know about all of you, but I think Japan is probably in one of the most vulnerable geopolitical positions it has ever been in since World War II right now. Yet we have a 90-10 split in the Diet in terms of who is making the decisions about defense spending, about security policy, about foreign relations, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I said at the beginning, this is unacceptable in my view. But who can change that? That's something that the government does have power to change. And then going back to the private sector, I think, frankly, and this is sort of why I wrote this book in 2020 in front of Goldman, Josei Shain no Sodatekata, was basically because at the end of the day, the government can only do so much for private companies, right? They can change some of the rules, they can bolster some of the infrastructure on childcare and elder care, et cetera. But what they can't really do is go inside companies and accelerate that promotion pipeline or build that pipeline or tell companies how to evaluate their talent, right? And that's where the onus or the responsibility of developing female talent lies inside those organizations as opposed to the government, right? There's serious limitations on what the government can do. Hence, that's why I wrote the book, because over many years of my own personal experience, making lots of mistakes as a manager, I had to manage people across Asia Pacific. There are differences in the way men and women feel and about their careers, about how confident or lack of confidence they have about telling people about their accomplishments, about how they respond to and react to performance reviews, all this stuff. I try to lay out because those are the tools, or those are the things that I think organizations, including academic institutions, need to focus on. Because if you don't focus on that at the micro level, you can't just say, point the finger at the government, say you're not doing your job. It's ultimately down to the employers, right? To be able to manage that talent. And I think in this day and age, where every institution, every company, every organization in this nation is running short on quality talent, this is a life or death, sort of situation, i.e., how are you going to attract the best quality talent into TUJ or any company unless you cast your net widely to the broadest possible, talent pool, and unless you manage that talent in such a way that is going to set them up for success in leadership roles, right? So, anyway, long-winded answer to your short question.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
David.
Go for it, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy. I think I've been listening to you talk about Womenomics for more than 20 years, and I'm happy to see that we're still working on this at different levels. I have a number of students who have a number of questions related to actually directly what you just said. Yes, we have good laws. That's great. A number of things have changed in Japanese society in the past 20, 30 years. That's great as well. But looking at some of these issues of gender roles and social expectations and issues of work-life balance, and just for example, women being given position, even with the same job, being given less responsibility. Some of the students would like to know, what do you think concretely can change inside corporations themselves? What can they change themselves to make this pipeline for young women in their careers not necessarily advantageous, but really equal for young women coming up in whether it's the corporate sector or whatever kind of business they're going into? Thinking because they are concerned about the attitudes towards women as well as the work hours, both of them impacting them for the future.
Well, one piece of advice that I would give is, if you're looking at various options for employment, that you try to find an organization that will be able to evaluate, promote, reward you for your output, for your performance, as opposed to time-based metrics like seniority, right, duration. And, I know many Japanese companies are now changing, they're trying to shift away from seniority-based metrics to performance or output-based ones. But there's still this sort of legacy of, when did you enter the company and how long have you been at the organization? And there's still not a lot of leapfrogging, I call it, for young people who are super talented to like a leapfrog over their, older superiors, right? So I think it's very important, especially for women, just in my own experience, because for better or for worse, we have life events, right? I know men, everybody has life events, but I think particularly in the case of women here in Japan, those life events are sometimes predictable, sometimes unpredictable, but ensuring that if you don't have this, like, I'm going to stay at this organization for 30 years mentality, but I want to get as much as I can out of this experience, that, again, every ounce of effort you're putting into the job is recognized, both criticize and recognize if you've done a good job. Because I think for a lot of women, there is a lot of time constraint. And I think it goes for any minority group, frankly, in this country. foreigners as well. So just ensuring that that is the kind of organization that you are choosing, I think is point number one. And point number two is, people, you can only be what you see. And so if you look at an organization, you see very few diverse leaders at the top. That to me is a sign of concern, right? Maybe they tell you that they plan to promote, minorities into leadership positions, but their actions speak louder than their words, right? So going for organizations where there is already a clear evidence that that is not only what they talk about, but that they walk that talk, I think is super important, especially for young women. And then finally, just making sure that you have, once you get into the organization, and of course, lateral hire or out of college or university, they're different paths, but ensuring that you have some kind of idea of what is that path. How do I get to that next level? Is that being articulated in a job description, or the first job and the second job? What are the promotion criteria to get to that next level? And that you surround yourself finally with people in the organization who will be sort of your sponsors, right? Who will be your cheerleaders, who will guide you, who will help you, advocate for you. Because I think this is where I found, in my own experience, men do a great job at this naturally. They're really good about sort of talking about their accomplishments and sharing, what they've done with other people, especially leaders. But I find women, this is like, they're allergic to doing this. It's very hard. And it's hard for any woman around the world. I haven't found any women around the world that are comfortable in touting their accomplishments. But it's not touting, it is educating people around you about what you've done. And you could have turned around a situation. You could have saved somebody who's going to leave the firm. You could have come up with a solution to a problem that everybody was, struggling with. It doesn't matter what it is. But if you don't tell people, beyond your immediate scope, then, it might as well not have been, done, I say. Particularly, I'm talking about particularly large, I've only been used to large organizations. So large organizations, especially global ones, especially where the headquarters, I call the mothership, is far, far away. You absolutely need to have people who are going to be a megaphone for you, champion for you, to get you, progressing through the organization.
Do you have, thank you so much. That I think was really helpful for a number of them. And related to this, there's a number of questions related to this then about how do we create more inclusive environments? And I guess you're talking about multinationals, or do you have examples of corporate initiatives to create more inclusive, say, environments that actually enable women leaders to shine more than, say, others?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done. I write a lot about this in my book, but everything from creating women's networks inside whatever organization, so you don't feel alone, that if there's an issue within the company that you feel everybody's concerned about, that you can raise it as a group as opposed to a lone single voice. I talk about sponsorship a lot as opposed to just mentorship, which I think is super critical, especially for getting women into those, really senior positions. I think that's very, very important. And also to constantly have this, mapping of your talent pool, and having something called a leadership pipeline review, putting people plotting them on this quadrant of, performance and then potential, right? Some people are terrific performers, but you don't really see them as leaders of the organization. Other people you see as leaders, but they're not performing, up to par. But ultimately, you want to promote those people who are both super performers and also super high potential, right? But kind of mapping that out and ensuring that when you're doing that mapping, that you're including people who might not have a big voice, who might not speak up in meetings, who might be less visible, right? And giving them those platforms, giving them that visibility or those opportunities to be visible is really, really critical, right? And then of course, training. A lot of people that, work in Japan come from a very different value set, right? If they came from a very domestic organization, they're not used to what does inclusive mean. And so having DE&I training, there's never a shortage of that. We all carry unconscious biases. I carry many of those myself. We all need to, be trained or retrained for these assumptions. And especially in a Japanese context or in a Japanese company operating in Japan versus a multinational company operating in Japan, there's so many iterations. But ensuring, for instance, LGBT personnel, a lot of people don't come out in Japan. And so having very open discussions about the topic alone, creating champions for those groups of people, is a huge signal, right? When you're recruiting or when you're trying to retain somebody. So all of these things are really, again, not every one of these things fits every organization. You have to come up with initiatives that fit the culture of your organization. But I think having, what is it, Shiniteki Anzen says, psychological safety, so that it is a corporate culture that you feel is welcoming of differing opinions, and you're not going to be shut down, is incredibly important, obviously, right?
Thank you. I'd like to take a few other comments that are coming to me and maybe focus them in one question. And looking at some things have changed. We have some ideas about how we should have more women in leadership, whether it's in the board, managerial level. But what about the reality of particularly the multinational corporate work structure, which makes it very difficult for women who say have either childcare, elder care, or other, say, disabled sister, brother, other care responsibilities to take on, say, a promotion, even if they're qualified, if they must work, say, 70 hours a week, 80 hours a week. And I know that's against the law, but that's not what we're talking about. So to balance all of these other outside care responsibilities that even still belong to women, generally, regardless of whatever ecumen advertising we have, and really moving up, is what part of this is actually not really a workers' rights issue as well for men? I've combined several questions into one long comment. Sorry about that.
So if the question is about, how to enable, I guess, women with so many competing obligations to encourage them, enable them to strive for those positions. Is that the question?
It's more about what needs to change in this system rather than putting the onus on women who have 40 hours of care work and 80 hours of work outside the home, rather than putting that onus on them. What needs to change there in this organizational culture?
Part of it is, these very deeply ingrained gender role stereotypes, which we're all still living with every day, whether you see it in the media or you see it in schools, PTA meetings where fathers are excluded. All of this sort of environmental stuff needs to be addressed in a very open, and candid environment, right? Why is it that way? What are kids exposed to when they're at a very young age? I think those are issues that Japanese society needs to confront full on. But I think what gives me some encouragement is, I work with startups every day. So this generation of young Japanese, particularly men, think very differently in general about life and work than their fathers and grandfathers did. And maybe, we look at a peculiar sample of entrepreneurs, but it's very encouraging, frankly, to me to see that there are men in the startup world, and these are startups, these are not big companies, right? That they take a year off. One company told us yesterday, this guy took 2 years off, right? Because they want to spend time with the family because their wives have, you know, other obligations. And so I'm hopeful that this different generation, this younger generation, who has different values about all of these things, will help, you know, because it's one thing for the so-called minority groups to be fighting for all these things, but when the majority joins this sort of campaign, whatever you want to call it, then I think change can be accelerated much, much faster. And, you know, other things that can, you know, have to change. We all know, like, you know, why can't Japanese people sponsor foreign domestic helpers? You know, the immigration related questions. There's a lot of things that, you know, could be changed because look at Hong Kong and Singapore. That's why a lot of women work, and it's because they can outsource very affordably and easily. So yes, there are things that the government can do, but I think it does require a much bigger, you know, approach, because this is systemic. This is across society. This is, again, what we're teaching kids at a very young age in school about what do women do versus men. And yeah, and again, people say, oh, there's not enough female role models. There actually are, and I wrote about many of them in my book, right? That people don't know about in Japan. Let's highlight them. Let's spotlight them. Let's showcase them. And hopefully young women and young girls can look up and say, hey, I didn't know I could become one of these, you know, and as a career. So of course it's a multifaceted, very large set of solutions, but I certainly don't think it's impossible.
Mega, would you have a question or some questions from your students as well?
Yes, I do. So one of my students really wants to know, and also it connects to a question that another person has asked Mamta about migrants. And my student wants to know more about your personal journey, like how did you feel in this environment of where there were a lot of restrictions and feeling restricted in a very conservative environment as you were working. And she also adds that, like in case of women who have worked abroad, and when they do come back and work in Japan, they feel more restricted. And maybe that is one of the reasons that they are not able to climb up the ladder. And additionally, adding on to Mamta's question, where she is asking, which is something that I'm also very keen on, because I do a lot of study on trailing spouses who move to Japan, who are very well educated, and they move to Japan but are not able to find jobs and end up becoming English teachers, or they have to really upskill themselves because their skills are not recognized, even though they do come from a very rich and skilled background in terms of knowledge, I mean. So would you like to comment on that? Specifically, I think this thing goes both for the migrant women as well as the Japanese women if they've lived abroad. And when they come back in a Japanese environment, there is a lot of suffocation they feel in that environment. So has it changed,
Yeah,
or
so-
like your personal
Yeah,
experience?
yeah. And again, I'm just one individual, so I'm not going to claim I represent any group or any large numbers of people by any means. But you know, I'm Japanese American, so I had some advantage because my blood is 100% Japanese. My parents are first generation immigrants to the United States, and we spoke Japanese at home. I wasn't anywhere fluent, but I was familiar with the culture, the food, all of that. So that allowed me to become what I call a chameleon, right? When I arrived in Japan as a Rotary Scholar right out of Harvard, I really felt alien, to be honest, right? I didn't speak Japanese well, and but because I look like I do, there's an expectation that I was native Japanese. So that forced me to learn very quickly. And like I said earlier, I think ultimately, you know, your choice of career, of place of employment is ultimately your own, right? So if you want to, in my case, I worked at a Japanese bank for 3 months in between my 2 years of grad school. I wore the uniform and everything. It was the most fascinating experience of my life. But when I was looking for, I came back to Japan to look for a job. I didn't apply for Japanese financial institutions because I just thought the way that I said, that I said earlier, they evaluate you. It's much more some time-based metrics versus, output and performance. I thought I didn't have that much patience. And so I opted to go with a foreign employer because I felt I would be more suited for, more performance and output-based measurement, because that's what I've been used to my entire life, right? Growing up in the States. And so I think for women who are, thinking about finding a job here, looking for those places of employment. I'm not saying Japanese companies don't do this. Of course, there are many Japanese companies that do have performance and output-based evaluation metrics and promotion systems. I'm just drawing very broad generalizations here. But whatever the nationality of the organization is, find an organization that's going to value and appreciate you for what you think you're really worth. I think it's super critical. And yeah, there's a lot of friends that are training spouses, and I would say it's predominantly because of language that they can't practice what their skills are in a Japanese context. But that's sort of hard to, I don't know what could be changed, immediately on that front. But I will say what has changed, I think, is the Japanese corporate appetite to hire non-Japanese nationals, not just females, but in many regards. And so I think a lot of, for example, even startups that we meet every day, a lot of the engineering teams are non-Japanese, or they're not even in Japan, right? They're sitting in Bangalore or somewhere else. And so, because simply put, the numbers just aren't enough here, right? There are not enough engineers or whatever, caregivers, or et cetera. And so people do have to rely on talent that is non-Japanese, that is willing to do those sorts of jobs. And I think that will only grow because the job shortages, the labor shortages, as you know, are only going to grow more acute over time.
But
Kathy, we
also,
have
just
please,
just a follow-up question. In case of for example, in your case, you knew the Japanese language, but you did live abroad. So the keigo might have been a sort of restriction, or was it no? Because many people who do know the Japanese language scale do not necessarily know the keigo that is, used in the Japanese environment. So was that a sort of challenge that you or women like you probably do come across in a work environment?
Yeah, so in my case, it's fairly obvious when they look at my name sheet that I'm not, 100% born and raised Japanese woman, right? Because my first name is phonetic, it's Kashi, right? And then my surname is Matsui. I still use my maiden name. And so at the get-go, they know I'm not 100% Japanese woman, which means, as many of you foreign women on this call know, you have a little bit of cushion, you have a bit of license to be less formal, not be perfect in keigo. I mean, still not perfect in keigo. So you could have used that to your advantage. And people say, oh, was it tough being a woman in finance? Not in my case, because as I said, I was measured very objectively at Goldman, and most of my clients, of course, here are Japanese and Japanese men. But I had the advantage of being the only female strategist and working in that career for such a long time while my Japanese competitors were rotating in and out of those roles. So people remembered me. So I actually found this to be an advantage. But again, in the beginning, I was young, I was female, I was non-Japanese, and I thought, oh, 3 strikes against me, I'm never going to get anywhere. But just think about for each of you, turning those weaknesses or handicaps, whatever you want to call it, into your weapons of strength. And I think there's many, and it's not immediate, it will take time for you to recognize those strengths, but you can fully leverage those abilities and strengths to your advantage here.
Kathy, I wanted to bring to your attention a couple of the questions that are in the students' participants chat box. One has to do with enforcing the equal pay provisions. And you mentioned that there's more disclosure required, but could the government not be doing more to actually enforce equal pay? It's been on the books for a long time. Second question has to do with how many women actually run for parliament If the outcome is only 10%, is it a very small number still running, and therefore the politicians that, excuse me, the big ceiling of men above us that you described in your TED talk, what could the political parties and politicians be doing? And third, there's a sensitive question. You've praised the tobacco industry for some of its what's the word I want here? Accomplishments in diversity and things. But the question was, couldn't we be encouraging less people to smoke rather than praising the tobacco companies? I'm not articulating the question as well as it was in the chat box, but so 3 real quickly, and I know that we're running a little bit short of time, about 7 or 8 minutes of your time left. Any of those questions?
So on equal pay, I think it is a good thing that at least the government's finally legislated that there is now disclosure requirements on the part of at least bigger companies to disclose their gender pay gap. This was not the case, as you know, before, and now it is. And if you look at any big companies, disclosures, no surprise, women get paid on average less than men. But there's also a very good reason behind that, is what we talked about earlier, which is because there are a few women in managerial positions that are higher paid, and a lot of women working part-time roles, no surprise. So at least there's more transparency, which I think is good. But ultimately, I think to strive for parity, like I said earlier, is how do we encourage that talent, that female talent, to work, say, full-time or more full-time, and then getting them into paths on the road to managerial leadership positions. And this isn't just about skill training. This is about coaching. This is about sponsorship. This is about giving them confidence, right? There's a lot of, sort of qualitative things that need to happen. So I think that, every country has a gender pay gap. Japan happens to have one of the largest ones. But like I said, I think a lot of it has to do with what positions a lot of these women hold. So it will take time, but I think there will be progress. On the political leadership question, what can be done? I said earlier, that's where I think quotas are necessary. Other countries do it. It's not, you don't have to do it permanently. But like I said, I think Japan is in an extremely vulnerable position where it sits in the Pacific Ocean. Who knows what's going to happen in November in the United States elections? And Japan probably could use some more balance in its most important decision-making body, which is the Diet. So I'm not quite sure why. I know why, but it's hard for them to embrace quotas. But that's something where I think they can make an immediate change and affect immediate impact by making such a change. And I'm on record for saying this all over the place. Finally, on the question of tobacco, I don't think I've ever praised the tobacco industry. I talked about one company in terms of their disclosure of gender pay equity and what they did following the fact that they discovered that they had a very big gender pay equity gap. I also talked about Salesforce in the United States, this company that had done something similar. So I'm just talking about these companies with respect to this narrow topic of how they addressed the gender pay equity gap. I am not praising the tobacco industry.
We do have, yes, we have just about 5 more minutes. Omega, please.
Sorry, maybe I can just ask one of the questions that student has put up, or do you have anything to?
No, please.
1 second. So one student has asked, how can people who live outside Japan support Japanese women in fighting for equality in Japan? And is this something that can be done on social media, or is this an issue that would be better fixed by those who are physically in the country? So basically, do you think, like, externally, if the women outside who are comparatively in a better position, can they be of any help in supporting the women in Japan or just bringing the change?
More voices, the better. So it doesn't matter where they come from. But the more people speak out about it, and I'd love to see more men, frankly, speak out about this issue. Having just women speaking out about it is great, but to really, make meaningful change, I think we need to engage more male champions.
Absolutely. Can't agree more.
Kathy, I found that we're able to save the chat questions and that we did not get to all of the questions that we wanted to address to you and the students and other participants wanted to address. We have only a couple of minutes, and to properly respect your time, and we know how busy you are, could we ask you to maybe summarize in the next 2 or 3 minutes what would you say is the absolute most important thing that we could be doing? But also tell us a little bit about your work with MPower partners. And so you get the last word in the remaining minutes.
So I retired from Goldman in 2020 and launched MPower Partners, which is Japan's first ESG, environment, social governance integrated global venture capital fund. That's a mouthful. With 2 of my female longtime friends, Yumiko Murakami and Miwa Seki, with the aim of helping to boost an area of the economy which needs a lot of support, which is innovation, which is the next generation of entrepreneurs. The Kishida administration has this very bold plan to increase venture investment by tenfold, create 100 unicorns. Targets and these goals are great, but who's going to do all the work? And so in our company, we want to help those entrepreneurs that are using technology for the most part to solve some of the biggest challenges facing society. But we're not a social impact fund. We're not doing this for charity. We have very large institutional investors investing in our fund, and we owe them a return. And so we are helping our startup companies in our portfolio with their businesses to scale their businesses, to help their businesses go global. And we're investing both in Japanese startups as well as overseas startups. So for Japanese startups, helping them to go beyond Japan, and global startups, helping them to enter the Japanese market. And we believe we are very focused on the ESG aspect of making a business as sustainable as possible. And we also have global networks, contacts that we can leverage that can help these businesses scale. We are probably also the only, we are the only female-led VC firm in Japan of this scale, $150 million US. And I think we are trying to also improve the diversity in this venture ecosystem, which is, frankly, could be a lot more diverse than it is today. But frankly, look at the United States as an example. Only 2% of venture dollars go to female founders. That to me is also unacceptable. Japan is a little bit around that number, but also very, very low. So you have half the population, right, of entrepreneurs that are not being fully tapped into. And as an investor, I want to have the complete opportunity set in front of me to choose from, not just half, right? That's like saying I want to hire or recruit the best baseball players in the country, but I'm only going to recruit in Kansai, not going to recruit in Kanto or the rest of the nation. And that's just putting yourself at a clear disadvantage. We happen to have half of our portfolio is comprised of companies whose founders were minority founders. A lot of them are female. So super excited about that and the opportunities we see ahead.
Wonderful. Kathy, as we commemorate and also celebrate your path-breaking and exemplary work, 25 years on, we want to thank you and on behalf of TUJ, ICAS, and all of our participants today, with apologies that we couldn't get through all of the questions, but our heartfelt appreciation to you. And all power to you in MPowers and what you are seeking to do in this phase of your professional career. Thank you very, very much. And thank you everyone for taking part today. Thank you again, Kathy.
Thank you.